So EA just announced Titanfall 2. Titanfall was one of those games where people didn't play for that long. I believe multiple YouTubers and just people all around eventually commented on and just stopped playing after maybe a month or two. And so the millions of copies of sales that EA actually gotten didn't last as long as even Call of Duty or Battlefield or any other first-person shooter. So in this video, I want to talk about the original Titanfall, and hopefully maybe improve the sequel in its iteration, Titanfall 2. And then next, I want to talk about another game design concept, that being the mechanical dissonance. A dissonance between a set of mechanics or a piece of content and another set of mechanics or a piece of content, to such an extent where these pieces of content or these mechanics kind of contradict with each other to such an extent that it kind of harms the overall game's atmosphere. I believe that happened in Titanfall 1, not 2, pardon. And it happened such that people literally began leaving the game because of it. And today I'd like to talk about the mechanical dissonance and hopefully improve Titanfall 2 from Titanfall 1's glorious failure. Now, before we get into it, I like to preface things about Titanfall and about the concept of a mechanical dissonance so that we can kind of get things out of the way and stop all confusion. So a mechanical dissonance, that contradiction between certain pieces of content or certain pieces of mechanics within a game, or just simply contradictions within a game about what a player is supposed to do, how they do it, whatever, they can actually be used in a very deliberate manner. A mechanical dissonance, that contradiction, isn't always a bad thing, but it can be if you're not entirely careful. For example, a deliberate use of a mechanical dissonance would be in the game The Last of Us. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say I never actually played The Last of Us. I did watch a Let's Play. But one of the biggest comments from most people who play it is that it has incredibly difficult and, frankly, bad shooting mechanics. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, because that contradicts with the very, very real combat in the game. Well, that's the point here, is that because you have such bad just firing mechanics, and you can't be as precise as you could be in, say, Call of Duty, or, Far Cry, any other game franchises that has firearms, you're forced, A, to be stealthy, and B, to kind of scrounge around the area. Players eke out, hours and hours and hours of gameplay from the campaign that lasted, maybe 12 or 14 hours altogether. That whole thing can last maybe 40 or 50 because you're having to use stealth and you're having to go into the different houses and buildings looking for stuff. That was a deliberate use of a mechanical dissonance. Is that necessarily bad design? Well, obviously that's for you to say. It just simply shows that there was a deliberate use. What I would argue a bad use of mechanical dissonance, if it was deliberate or not, would be in Dota 2 or League of Legends. The concept of last hits. When you get the last hit, the killing blow on a minion or on an enemy player, you get all of the gold and all the experience, if I understand the mechanics of those games well enough. So what ends up happening is that you have this problem where you have, say, the support, or essentially anyone who isn't the carry of the team, be it in Dota 2 or League of Legends, and they're getting the last hits, and they're denying the last hit to the carry, the guy who's supposed to win you the game, essentially. And what that causes, that especially for new players, they're being incentivized through gold and through experiences by simply becoming more powerful to get those last hits. Yet you have to save the last hits for your teammates. So in a lot of ways, for the new player experience, one could argue that this mechanical dissonance, this incentive that isn't actually a good thing, maybe should be changed, or maybe it's purely deliberate, as in that should be a thing, where you should be incentivized. Again, when you put a mechanical dissonance in the game, you have to make sure it's deliberate. In Titanfall 1, I don't actually feel it was deliberate, which is the entire point and our discussion for today. Now to get on to Titanfall 1, specific information that we need to know. The first one is that we're going to be focusing on specifically the weapons of the pilots. We're not going to be talking about the game modes that you can play, not really a huge focus on the maps, and not really the Titan combat, mostly because the modes, most people played attrition, which was arguably the best mode because it really utilized what Titanfall was about, because it allowed you to do so many different things. And then the Titan gameplay was incredibly well polished. The only problem with the Titan gameplay is that there wasn't a whole lot of content, and arguably not enough depth in the Titan gameplay to really justify a full $60 or $40 release, which is why you have to have the pilot combat in there, and good pilot combat, in order to supplement the Titan combat. Maybe I could do a whole other video on the notion of vehicle combat in Titanfall and other games, but that is, of course, off topic. So we're going to be focusing on pilot combat and specifically the weapons. Now, the thing with the weapons that we need to understand is that they're horribly balanced, but not in the usual way that we think of balancing. You know, it seems that most people think of balancing, and especially developer-side balancing, as just simply change numbers, and you'll change how the weapon functions, and you'll make it better. You know, a statistical buff or nerf. That's how you balance weapons, mostly from a developer side of things, and that's usually how most people look at balancing changes, statistical, number-based buffs or nerfs. Well, the problem here is that in Titanfall 1, all 10 of the weapons are almost perfectly balanced. On paper, here's the thing. When you look at them in a numbers way, and when you apply them to other first-person shooter tropes, sniper rifles, precision weapons, the shotguns, automatic weapons, etc., they're not really that poorly balanced. Like, they're actually very well balanced. The problem that we have today is that it's not a statistical balance that we're talking about, it's that mechanical dissonance. You see, despite the fact that players had access to 10 weapons, only about maybe 3 or 4 of them, I'd argue 3 of them, were actually used by 99% of the player base, because they were the only weapons that actually made sense and didn't fully contradict with the system's mechanics and other pieces of content in Titanfall 1. That's where our mechanical dissonance comes in. Now, the biggest reason we're actually focusing on Titanfall 1 here with the mechanical dissonance is that people actually left the game, as I said earlier, very, very quickly, almost in droves. YouTubers abound commented on it. It seemed almost weird. People just got bored of it. Well, a lot of people actually pointed, I would argue, if I read up and if I listened enough, that it was simply a lack of content. You only had 10 weapons in the game, you had 15 maps, which is a whole lot, granted, but you only had like 10 weapons, you had like 3 Titans, and the Titans didn't really differentiate that much, and then the weapons had maybe like 1 or 2 like modifications you could make to them. Well, the thing is that you can have a game that has like virtually no content to it, yet has a great deal of depth. And that's what a few games actually opt for. Arguably, a lot of indie games, specifically, say, Faster Than Light, don't actually have enough content. Now, Faster Than Light actually has a pretty decent amount of content, like pretty good for like the $10 I spent on it. But because of the way it works, it's a roguelike or roguelite, they're interchangeable at this point, you could actually go 30 or 40 hours without hitting 3/4 or even half of the content that's actually in the game. That's huge, is it not? But because of the depth, I was able to put 40, 50, maybe even 60 hours into Faster Than Light, despite the fact that I was only meeting certain pieces of the content as I played. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of a neat little note that if you build the game such that it has a lot of depth versus a lot of content, you can kind of supplement that lack of content. Now, I see I've missed out the opportunity of explaining what I mean by content in depth. So content in a game is literally just the game, essentially. It's all of the mechanics, it's the textures you see, it's the moves that you have, it is the game. That is content, just the game that you see and play with. Depth is a more abstract concept. Depth is the idea that the content interacts with each other, and the more depth you have, the more interactive the content is with itself and with the player. So games that have a lot of depth have a lot of different unique interactions. They almost have a density of things that the player can actually do compared to games that, say, have a lot of content but very little depth. The player doesn't really interact with the world a huge amount. But that's the major difference between the two. Content is literal game. Depth is the interactions between the content, the pieces of content, and the player to the content. Okay, sorry for the gigantic preface and intro. We're finally going to get into the meat of the video, that being the actual weapons in Titanfall and how unbelievably broken they are. So, the thing we have to understand is that all the weapons are balanced on paper. And then what we have to further understand is that the 3 weapons that I mentioned, they aren't overpowered in a sense. Those weapons are actually the only balanced weapons in the game. Every other weapon in the game is underpowered, beyond all possible belief. That's why no one actually uses them. So going into the weapons, we're going to split up the 10 weapons into 3 groups. First, we have a group of 4 weapons, then we have a group of 3 weapons, and lastly we have that little group of 3 weapons that I would argue to be the only little balanced ones in the game that people actually used. So, moving on. The first group of weapons that we have, we're going to be calling them the precision weapons. That is your Hemlock BFR, the G2A4 rifle, semi-automatic. The Hemlock is burst fire, I believe. The Longbow DMR, semi-automatic, and the Kraber sniper rifle. Either it's really slow firing or it's bolt action. I can't remember. It's been, probably years since I've played Titanfall specifically. So, the biggest dissonance we have here, now, with the 7 weapons I'm going to talk about before we get to the 3 at the end, there are a variety of things in the game that just kind of wreck them beyond all belief. We're just going to focus on the major things, like the biggest heavy hitters that hurt them. So, with the precision weapons, they are precision weapons. They follow the usual first-person shooter trope. They require more skill, but they give you more reward. It's that idea that you have this weapon that doesn't really give you that huge of an advantage, even, say, at range, where you would need precision weapons. For the most part, you use these weapons because you are good at the game and you want a better reward, theoretically. Well, the problem that we face is that in, say Call of Duty, when you used a burst fire rifle or a semi-automatic rifle, or hell, one of the big I'ma kill you in one shot sniper rifles, it's already difficult enough. Let's be very frank. Even in Call of Duty, using a sniper rifle, even when you're quickscoping, even then, it's actually still just as difficult. Now here's the problem with Titanfall. Because of the parkour mechanics in the game, you take that difficulty in Call of Duty and you magnify it. And it's so incredibly difficult to use precision weapons in Titanfall, and it's to such an extent that the benefit and bonus you get from using precision weapons doesn't outweigh the just gigantic skill and the gigantic disadvantage you're putting yourself at. Even with the precision weapons, the basic idea is that the better you are, the better you're going to perform. Well, the problem is that in Titanfall, for the most part, no matter how good you are, there are certain limitations. This is actually present in Call of Duty as well. Well, these limitations are only more pronounced with the parkour system, and the difficulty to use them, even when you are, just the fundamental disadvantage, if that makes any sense. You're just using them, it's already difficult as it is. So, to really break it down, precision weapons require higher aim. The problem is that every other weapon in the game is meant to kind of give you a bit of leeway in the aim. So the R101C carbine, it's meant to be the Call of Duty or Battlefield or Halo equivalent of that weapon that is average in damage, average in range, average in aim down sight speed, average in everything. It's meant to be that weapon that players can use at any time and that they can just kind of start the game with. Well, the thing is that the R101C carbine has an incredibly high rate of fire. In Call of Duty, the average, decent weapon that you start the game with or whatever, it would have maybe 650, 700, 750 rounds per minute automatic rate of fire. The carbine literally has an 800 and higher than 800 rounds per minute rate of fire. This is the equivalent of essentially the AEK in Battlefield where you pull the trigger and it starts shooting up to the sun immediately, but it has pretty decent recoil. This same thing applies to virtually every other weapon in the game. Every other weapon is meant such that you can you either put more bullets out into the air against your opponents, or it's some other factor that just simply makes it easier despite everyone moving around. This kind of concept isn't being applied to the precision weapons. So you have incredibly high rates of fire for all the other weapons because they understand that you are moving around very quickly, but some kind of helping factor isn't applied to the precision weapons. So, like, say, the DMR or the Kraber or the G2A4, like, you're pulling the trigger. And the problem is that you're pulling this trigger, dealing with the recoil inherent with it, and you have essentially one bullet, maybe two bullets, depending on the weapon you're using, to deal out all of the damage you need to kill the pilot. This is incredibly difficult to do, end of story, in Call of Duty or Battlefield. This is only exasperated because now your enemy pilots, the targets you're actually trying to shoot at, can move around incredibly quickly in the horizontal plane, left and right, and back and forth. But now, the way Titanfall is designed with the parkour, there's a very real vertical element. Most people in most video games are meant to only shooting in a very vertical way. Right out in front of them and to the left and right. It's just, you're looking out into a field. That is the horizontal plane. Well, with Titanfall, with such an emphasis on vertical gameplay, because, to be a pilot, if you're running around on the street, you die from Titans or just other pilots who are in buildings. Like, you have to be above the ground in some form, or you have to be moving very, very quickly. Because of this, you take the difficulty to shoot someone in like Call of Duty or Battlefield, and you make it much more difficult because of the vertical element and because of the simple speed. Not to mention that as a pilot yourself, when you're jumping around roofs with the carbine, you can just kind of plant yourself in the ground and then start shooting at someone. If you miss, you miss, and you just continue on. If you kill them, you kill them. Okay, whatever, you continue on. With the Kraber, the DMR, the G2A4 to an extent, you're given a more long-range scope, and because of the focus you need to, use that long-range scope and to kill this guy with the more skill, you kind of put yourself in a tunnel visioning thing. So you're bouncing around, you see a pilot, you have to stop where you are, line up to shoot them, and then if you kill them, you kill them. If you miss, you miss, whatever. More than likely you're going to miss because the weapons are just so damn difficult to use. And then you have to leave that scope and reassess everything that's happening around you, which in and of itself destroys the map awareness that you need in Titanfall, because of just how fast you move, because of Titans, because of minions, because of everything. So, really, the fact is that these weapons contradict with the biggest selling point to Titanfall. Not Titans, no, it was the parkour. So we have 4 of the 10 weapons that literally break, arguably, one half of the game, because it's so much more difficult to use them. Now, obviously, there are people who are beyond amazing at the Kraber sniper rifle, or the G2A4, or the Hemlock, or whatever. Kudos to those guys. But we're balancing on a mass scale here. We're not worrying about anecdotal evidence right now. We're not worrying about the 2% of players. When you take 4 of the weapons out of the 10, you need those 4 weapons to impact a huge majority of the player base. Otherwise, they're completely useless as pieces of content. They shouldn't be in the game. The fact that there were 4 precision weapons to begin with kind of boggles my mind. It almost seems like Respawn Entertainment, the developers of Titanfall, put those weapons in the game purely just to kind of compete with Call of Duty, compete with Battlefield, check off the list of weapons that are needed. There are people out there who can use those weapons very well. But at the end of the day, the vast, vast majority of players don't use those weapons. And when that's the case, you need to rethink what you're doing. Now we're moving on to our second group of weapons. This is the next group of weapons that isn't actually used by most people. And we're going to call these the miscellaneous weapons. They include the Spitfire LMG, the R97 compact SMG, and the EVA-8 shotgun. Now, we're going to first look at the first two weapons because they can kind of be grouped into the same thing. So, the idea behind the LMG and the SMG was that you lower your overall minion and pilot effectiveness, just the basic infantry guys, and you improve your damage against Titans when you rodeo them. Now, for players who, people who haven't played Titanfall, there's this concept of the rodeo. So it's essentially the equivalent of walking up to a tank and battlefield, crawling on top of it, and then shooting the guys in there. You crawl onto the Titan, you pull out some power core, important blowy up thing, and you start shooting the inside of the Titan. You're not killing the pilot, you're just shooting the Titan itself. And what ends up happening is you deal more damage with the R97 compact SMG and the Spitfire LMG compared to the damage you would deal with, say, the Carbine, or the Kraber, or the shotgun, or the Car SMG, or whatever. You deal more while you're rodeoing compared to other weapons, at the cost of your effectiveness against pilots and minions. This sounds like a cool idea. You're using the rodeo mechanic, and you kind of benefit it in a way. The problem here is that these two weapons their own mechanical dissonance is that they contradict with another piece of content. That piece of content, actually 4 pieces of content because it's 4 weapons, would be the anti-Titan weapons. So, in your loadout as a pilot, in Call of Duty, where you have to get rid of your secondary to get a rocket launcher, which is essentially completely useless except for killing, say, the flying around kill streaks. In Titanfall, you get the equivalent of that rocket launcher in your loadout at all times, and you continue moving around just as fast and all that. So what that means is that you already have a weapon that's good at killing Titans already. You already have a weapon that does the rodeoing job. But then you say, well, rodeoing deals more damage than the anti-Titan weapons, and for those who have actually played Titanfall, you are technically correct. The problem is that doing the rodeo is so dangerous that the risk isn't actually worth the reward. So we're going to make the assumption that you have the best case scenario when you're rodeoing. That would be there is a lone Titan with one pilot inside of it, and you run up onto it. There are no other minions around, no other pilots, no other enemy Titans. You're just there. So you jump on with your Spitfire LMG or your compact SMG, and you start going to town on their back of their Titan head, whatever. Explosions are happening around you, cool shit, you're being the badass. What's going to immediately happen is that we're going to further assume that Titan doesn't have electric smoke. So electric smoke, for those who don't know, is something that Titans can deploy whenever they're being rodeoed. And then there are a few other uses for it. Essentially, it's a cloud of death that Titans can walk through, and it kills pilots and whatnot. So you just kind of sit there, you let electric smoke kill the rodeoing pilot. We're going to assume that electric smoke isn't there, despite the fact that electric smoke is the most popular modification for your Titan. We're going to assume that this Titan uses Vortex Shield for whatever reason, because it's a new player, or they're dumb, or something. So that player, this is, by the way, the best case scenario for when you're rodeoing. That player now gets out of their Titan. What happens then is that you, as the rodeoing player, have to jump off of their Titan, which puts their Titan into an auto-Titan mode. He's walking around, hulking around with the weapon, but he's an AI, so he's not as smart as a player. And what's going to happen is that now, as a rodeoing player, with your Spitfire LMG and the compact SMG, the two weapons that are less effective at killing pilots, you now have to face a pilot and an automatic Titan. So the thing with a pilot is that it's dangerous in and of itself, and you are immediately put at a disadvantage when taking on this pilot. Not to mention that this auto Titan it's got an aimbot, essentially. If you stay on the ground trying to kill the pilot, you will die, because that Titan will step on you, it will shoot you, it will do weird things to your body, and it will destroy you. So you have to keep bouncing around and be janky such that the automatic Titan can't kill you. But when you're being janky and jumping around, it's harder to hit the enemy pilot. Not to mention that because of these two weapons and how they're balanced, they do less damage and stuff against enemy pilots. So this pilot and this Titan already has a gigantic advantage against you, and it spirals out of control. It has to be apparent at this point. Rodeoing does not, essentially insta-kill Titans. It doesn't actually do that much extra damage compared to, another Titan or to your anti-Titan weapons. And so what ends up happening is that 99% of the players in the game realize that these two weapons were essentially redundant because the risk and does not actually meet the reward, and that risk and reward doesn't even take into account the fact that there are anti-Titan weapons in the game to begin with. Then when you apply the fact that there are anti-Titan weapons to begin with, those two weapons become even more redundant. And I'm not even going to bring up the concept that, okay, you should be rodeoing an enemy Titan when that enemy Titan is fighting one of your ally Titans, because at that point you may as well simply be firing your anti-Titan weapon as well. Yes, you're not going to be doing as much damage, but it's also safer, and you do essentially the exact same thing. You're splitting the attention of the enemy Titan. What we have to understand is that because of the inherent dangers of doing rodeos to begin with, and then with anti-Titan weapons, they are incredibly redundant. They are, for all intents and purposes, useless to 90% of the player base. Which brings us to our last weapon that we're going to be making fun of, the EVA-8 shotgun. Now, when I first used the shotgun in Titanfall during my 100+ hours of play, it kind of made me happy, Because Titanfall was the first game that really took shotguns and did something kind of unique with them, The parkour plus the shotgun, it was a nice blend. It felt good to kind of run around and then kind of just shotgun a pilot in the face. Then after about 5 or 10 minutes, I realized why no one was using the shotgun. Because it's essentially useless and redundant in the game space. Now, when you have vehicles in a game, you need larger maps. Titanfall has vehicles, therefore it has larger maps. Larger maps don't blend well with shotguns. That's why in Battlefield you so rarely see shotguns outside of the very, very small maps. The boring maps that people play on because they want kills or whatever, not because they want a fun game. So what ends up happening is that you have the EVA-8 shotgun, which, while it does blend with the parkour pretty well, is almost completely useless because most of the pilots are on the rooftops or something, kind of almost out in the open in a sense, moving around so quickly themselves, and then you have to deal with the simple fact that you have a very large map, and other pilots can move around fast, and then it spirals up out of control to such an extent where no one uses a shotgun. Titans, and the fact that you needed a big map, killed the shotgun. And that makes me so damn sad. Because Titanfall was the first time that I actually used a shotgun halfway competitively. It was so... oh jeez. Well guys, that brings us to our third group of weapons. The only weapons in the game that I would argue are actually balanced, and therefore, most of the players actually used them. So, the next three weapons we're going to talk about, the only balanced ones in the game, are the R101C carbine, the CAR SMG, and the Smart Pistol. First, we're going to talk about the first two, the carbine and the CAR SMG. These two weapons essentially are used for the exact same reason. They are versatile. They are the equivalent of that weapon that you put in a game that applies to virtually every situation in the game. They are the definition of the jack of all trades, master of none, which to a lot of people sounds like perfectly fine balance, which it is on paper, and it works for Call of Duty and it works for Battlefield. The thing is that Titanfall is a game where you need versatility. So, take for example in Battlefield. You may spawn at point A instead of point B. Point A has a lot of buildings in it. It's very dense, so you can justify using a shotgun or an SMG or a high rate of fire assault rifle or something of that nature. And you do stuff in there, and because of your relatively slow player speed in comparison to vehicles and other stuff, you are essentially planted in that one space, and if you leave there, you kind of get killed or whatever because you are simply less effective. Well, then you can justify when you spawn at point B, which is much more open, it's maybe got a field around it or something, you can then justify switching to a semi-automatic weapon, a lower rate of fire assault rifle, a sniper rifle, something of that nature. So in the same map, in the same match of players beating each other to death, you are actually switching up your tactics. That's kind of interesting. That's usually what ends up happening when you have big maps in a game. This applies to Halo, to Battlefield, to every game that has big maps. End of story. Well, the problem we face here is that in Battlefield, you are relatively slow. In Titanfall, pilots, save for one specific instance with one specific Titan, are literally the fastest thing in the game. When you understand the parkour, you can get from one area of the map, which is very open, to another area of the map, which is fairly closed in a matter of literally 10 or 15 seconds. Literally. That's how fast you go in the game. So what that means is that players face a great many situational, differences on a very regular basis. Literally in Titanfall. And this is part of the reason I love the game so much. It keeps things varied. But you can, in a span of maybe 30 seconds to a minute, go from killing minions, to killing a pilot, to attacking an enemy Titan, to getting in your own Titan, to ejecting from your Titan, to rodeoing that same enemy Titan, and then jumping off, and crazy shit's happening all around. And that's in literally 60 seconds of gameplay. Now imagine each individual match lasting 10 or 15 minutes. The fact of the matter is that when you combine a lot of speed with big maps, you change up gameplay a lot, even within those maps. So at the end of the day, if you put weapons that are meant for specific things, you're going to steer players away from them, because the fact of the matter is that in Titanfall, players need versatility, which is why the R101C carbine, and is why the Car SMG, which are essentially the same weapon, all things considered, are used so much. They are the jack of all trades, master of none. That's the problem. Now we're going to get on to the most controversial weapon in all of Titanfall. Arguably the entire first-person shooter industry. Maybe that sniper rifle from Counter-Strike could be considered on this list too, but I'd say the Smart Pistol is higher. Now, for those who don't know, the Smart Pistol is, you've got your TV screen, you've got the game playing. You then have this octagonal shape box, essentially, that is in your screen. That is the size of the reticule is something that helps you aim, of the Smart Pistol. And what happens is that as you walk up to minions or other players, it starts to literally lock onto them. And then you pull a trigger, and the bullets fly out as almost, I think they're hit scan actually. So as soon as you pull the trigger, whatever you were locking onto gets damaged. Whether you kill them or not depends on how many locks you got on them. But essentially, that created a lot of rifts within the Titanfall community, because it kind of destroyed the basic design of first-person shooter gameplay. You have to aim to get kills and do stuff of that nature. What no one actually ever mentioned was the fact that the Smart Pistol takes a very, very long time to lock onto enemy pilots, meaning that literally every other weapon in the game, and I mean literally every other weapon in the game, killed faster than the Smart Pistol. Yet people continue to complain about the Smart Pistol. My friends, the Smart Pistol was the best designed gun in Titanfall, hands down. You want to know why? Well, we have the Car SMG and the R101C carbine. Those weapons actually, arguably, contradicted with the parkour and the mechanics of the game to begin with. They just didn't contradict as much as the other weapons, and because of their versatility, people used them. The Smart Pistol was the only weapon in the game that didn't contradict at all. So first and foremost, we have the blending of FPS gameplay with parkour. With the Smart Pistol, you can parkour around and do all this crazy stuff. You can essentially hit fire everyone as you're jumping around, and it's very interesting and cool that you can do that. And it blends first-person shooter, gameplay with the notion of parkour. It switched out different sets of skills. So with any other weapon in the game, your skills are, can you aim this weapon? With a Smart Pistol, all of that skill went into how well you can parkour, and whether or not you have to kind of switch your screen around, because if you left your screen off of the enemies, you couldn't actually kill them. Next thing, what made the Smart Pistol so very interesting was that it almost turned Titanfall into a MOBA, like Dota 2 or League of Legends. So in those games, you have the carry I mentioned earlier. When you use a Smart Pistol, you are that carry. You win the game for your player, for your teammates. Because with the Smart Pistol, you're you're less effective against pilots as you are against minions. And then you do virtually nothing against Titans. Even when you rodeo them, you do essentially nothing. So you put yourself at, objectively, when you look at numbers, as I did, you are putting yourself at an objective disadvantage. End of story. Well, what that means is that now you have to parkour around, you have to kind of improve your abilities as a player. You have to be better than everyone else because you're having to use the parkour system and engage pilots in a very interesting and dynamic way, to such an extent where a pilot can literally be planted on the ground as you're parkouring around, and at that point, they essentially win. Because all they have to do is just aim at you. It's like shooting skeet and trap. But what makes the Smart Pistol so interesting is that it kills minions very, very, very quickly, because it can lock on to multiple targets at once. And there is a reason I'm referring to the grunts in the game as minions. Grunts are little guys who kind of supplement the battlefield and make it look interesting. Make it feel like that battlefield-size battle. Well, the thing is that minions contribute to the timer that it takes for you to get your Titan. Everyone has a timer to get their Titan. Well, you lower that timer by killing pilots, other Titans, and by killing minions. So my friends, when you use a Smart Pistol, your sole objective is to kill other minions. Kill enemy minions. When you do that, your timer goes down faster than anyone else, because you kill minions literally faster than anyone else. So, at the very beginning of a match, if you're using the Smart Pistol, your sole job is to kill minions quickly. And then, as you're killing minions quickly, you get your Titan quicker. So theoretically, if you're a half-decent player, you are getting your Titan faster than literally anyone else on your team. And if there is no other Smart Pistol user in the game, faster than anyone else in the game. So it turns you into the carry, because once you get your Titan, you are objectively, there is no argument here. You are objectively stronger as a Titan than as a pilot, and you can go to town then, and you give your team such a gigantic boost. So the Smart Pistol has this insane amount of depth. And the fact that people complained about it, yeah, it was a frustrating thing to fight against, but holy shit. The fact that it could blend parkour and then fully utilize the minions in the game, turning it into essentially a MOBA. The fact that happened, it was so interesting, it was so dynamic, it's almost academic in the way you look at it, and the fact that people glossed over all of this with Titanfall makes me so sad. The Smart Pistol was incredibly well balanced, because it was the only weapon in the game that didn't have a mechanical dissonance. Well, I suppose it's all the weapons, and I hope I've proven to you why three of the weapons were the only balanced ones in the game. And I hope I explained to you why people left so early. When most of the player base is only using about 3 of the 10 weapons, I think it really impacts the gameplay. And it takes that depth that you as a developer were trying to create, and it tosses it in the trash. Because you allowed a mechanical dissonance to occur. So, in conclusion, if you put a mechanical dissonance in the game, it needs to be deliberately. It needs to be put in there specifically to make the game experience better. If it doesn't make the game experience better, then you have, in a sense, failed as a developer. So, either avoid them, or have a reason of putting them in there. And lastly, I say we all look to Titanfall 2. There are a lot of people, including me, who loved the original game. That's part of the reason why I'm sort of hard on it. dumping hundreds of hours into it was, well, it kind of put me in a different perspective in first-person shooting. And it really made me love the notion of parkour and of movement in gameplay, not only just positioning and aiming and all that. Like, maybe you can really build a game around advanced movement, around advanced planning, around advanced strategy, around all of that. But unfortunately, Titanfall, while it was a financial success by far and above, as a game, it flopped. End of story. And that's because one half of the gameplay, the pilot gameplay, was borked from the very beginning. And the developers agreed with me in a sense. People can get mad all they wish at what I have said today. But the fact of the matter is that all the precision weapons, they got a buff. The other 3 weapons that I mentioned, they got buffs of some sort. And the other 3 weapons that I mentioned, the only balanced ones, they got nerfs. And I think that stands for something. So guys, without further ado, I suppose this is Shapeless Horror. After, 43, 44 odd minutes, finally, signing off.